This is Capitalize Your Finances, the show representing you, a select group of excited, ready, and fired up listeners seeking to potentially maximize your money moves and get after it. We don't settle for generic advice of always and nevers. Our currency is our intellect, and we constantly seek the logical way of likely creating advantages to potentially maximize wealth for our personal and unique situations. The show brings you this step-by-step framework to capitalize your finances in the aspects of your financial situation, and we strive to explore strategies and ideas to potentially help you capitalize on your financial decisions. We are capitalizers, and this is our show.
Welcome back to Capitalize Your Finances. As always, I'm your host, Christopher A. Paniotu, the Cap in Capitalize. And today's special guest has had a massively profound impact on my life. So much so that after our first interaction, I actually did an entire episode dedicated to just that conversation. He is the author of one of my favorite books of all time, Richer, Wiser, Happier. He's the co-author of The Great Minds of Investing and The Education of a Value Investor, co-written by one of my favorite investors, Guy Spear, the legendary Mr. William Green. William, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Absolutely. And you know, before we dive into the meat of the episode, because you've done a fair amount of these before, and most people, they just dive into who is the coolest investor, very investment focused and oriented. But one thing that you've actually done for me as not only an investor and a planner, but also a podcast host, is really take a moment to dive into the deep profoundness of who the person is, because that's where the value lies. And so before we do all of that, I actually wanted to go back to the days before you were known as the amazing author of Richer, Wiser, Happier. And so growing up in London, what was that moment that made you want to become a financial journalist or writer? And more importantly, was there a person that really pushed you into that success? Or did the stars just all align and you just had this God-given gift?
I knew that I wanted to be a writer from very, very early on. So I remember I had this grandmother I really adored, my grandma Julie, and she had an apartment in the center of London. I remember being in her living room when I must have been about 8 or 9, maybe even 7, but not much older than 7, 8, or 9. And my uncle, who was called Dick Peer, who was a professor at Nottingham University, a well-known professor of politics, said to me, "So William, what do you want to do when you're older?" And I said, I want to be a writer. And I think I probably surprised myself by saying that. It was the first time I think I'd ever said that aloud. And he, to his immense credit, gave me this incredible advice where he said to me, he had this really lovely manner, and he said, all of my friends who became writers always said that the most important thing is just to write a lot, because then you get your voice. It takes a while to find your voice. And there was it's very good advice, but B, there was something so not patronizing about it, that he took this little kid and he took him seriously, and he didn't look down on him, you know, with that kind of arch amused look when a kid says like they want to do something that sounds unlikely. And the other thing that was really notable about it in retrospect is he had written several books himself, and he was so modest that he didn't mention that. And so there was something so exemplary about that behavior on multiple fronts. He was a very lovely man. And then I studied English literature at university. And so I spent the beautiful thing about the education system in England, which doesn't suit some people, but suited me because I was bad at so many subjects, is that you could specialize. And so I just did English literature at Oxford, and so I spent 3 years just reading great authors. You know, you would spend a semester where you read every single Shakespeare play, or you would read an author a week, like you'd read Jane Austen in a week. So you'd spend your holidays reading Jane Austen novels and Thomas Hardy novels and George Eliot novels, and then you'd get to college and you'd do one author a week. So I was really just immersed in good writing. And so I knew that I wanted to be a writer, but I didn't actually have any interest in the stock market at all. That came much later. That came in my 20s, when my brother and I owned an apartment in London, and we sold it because he bought a much grander apartment in London. He's a very successful lawyer, and I suddenly had this windfall. It wasn't a huge amount of money, but it was enough that I had to actually figure out, what am I going to do with this? And then I started to read a lot about investing. And then it just struck me as this amazing game where if you were smart and you thought well, you could make money with money. And that just seemed like such an appealing thing for a lazy, sort of subversive young person who didn't really want to work hard. And so that was kind of the dream from early on. And then at a certain point, those two fascinations, the game of investing and the idea of just being intelligent about something and stacking the odds in your favor by being intelligent about this game, and combining that with storytelling, that turned out to be incredibly fertile. And I think the reason is that these investors are just really strange and interesting characters. So for a storyteller, focusing on great investors turns out to be surprisingly interesting.
Sure. And going on top of that, one question that just came to my mind. So being a recently new girl dad, the impact on that your grandparents or grandfather had on you, kind of going off the cusp here and freestyling it, but what has that impact provided you when your kids have come to you and said, hey, Dad, I want to do X, Y, Z, and who knows, right? They may be telling you to do something. They want to do something that you're going, this is not looking good. I mean, have you seen that transition into your parental life?
Well, I have two kids. I have a daughter called Madeline, who just turned 22 the other day, and a son called Henry, who's about to turn 25. And so I think a lot about, as you must do, congratulations on your new child.
Thank you.
I think a lot about this whole question of just, what kind of model you're providing for your kids. And so in the same way that Dick Peer, this writer who gave me, and professor who gave me great advice, he didn't dismiss my dreams. He treated them with respect. I try very seriously to do that with my kids, to make sure that if they're serious about something or interested in something, I treat it with real respect. And so they're both very musical, and I really would love it if they became musicians. And for most people, they would look at this and think, that's such an insecure profession, and why would you do that? But most of my friends are, writers, authors, filmmakers. They've all gone into crazy professions that are difficult. I was friends with an actor. One of my close friends at high school became one of the stars in The Wire, that TV show.
Yeah.
And so, the idea that you can kind of do anything, you don't want to dismiss that. You don't want to give your kids or other young people bad advice and lead them to do something that you think they're not talented at. But I always feel like you want to encourage people to buy the lottery ticket. You don't. I remember once, I think it was Jim Carrey talked about how his father, I think, was an accountant and had a miserable life as an accountant, and then I think got laid off as an accountant or something. Mm-hmm. And he's like, this guy was really talented. Why, you can fail at the thing that you didn't want to do. Yeah. And so I do think you want to encourage your kids to buy the lottery ticket, and then at the same time, you also just want to, I think, try to set a good model in the way that you live your own life, because you fail in so many ways as a parent, as an employee, as an employer. I mean, I don't know about you, Chris, you're younger than me, but I've just failed at so many things. There's this wonderful quote from Winston Churchill where I think he talks about how success is basically going from one failure to another without visible loss of enthusiasm. Mm-hmm. And so I think the ability to kind of keep going through all of these setbacks, and even though things seem impossible often, that in a way I think has been maybe more helpful as a model for my kids than any of the stuff that I've said to them. I'm actually trying to model indomitable perseverance in the face of steep odds, failure, mistakes, incompetence, all of the hapless stuff that I do. So I've not really hidden from them my struggles. I make it pretty clear that life has not always been easy, and I mess up the whole time.
Well, and I can tell you, yes, I am a little bit less vintage on Earth as you, but I've had my fair share of mistakes and setbacks as well. And your life story up until this point has been really an epitome of what your grandfather instilled in you, because you've lived all over the place. I mean, you've been super fortunate to live in places like London, Hong Kong, New York. And so reflecting on your time in each area, what were some of the most important learning experiences you took away from those that made you a better writer?
I don't know if they made me a better writer, but I mean, it's been fascinating in terms of just the richness of life to live in these different places. So I grew up in London in a slightly dreary part of London, like in the outskirts, and I felt like I was always waiting for a bus to get into town, and it was dark and it was a little grey, and I would be picked up from school by my mom at 4 o'clock, and it would often be dark already and rainy. And I think I was very susceptible to the light, to the lack of light. And so in some ways I feel kind of, my memory of that is kind of gloomy. And then when I moved to New York when I was so then I went to Oxford. So I spent 3 years, I was at boarding school for 5 years. I went to Eton, which is, where people like Prince William and Prince Harry went. And that was very strange. So you literally had something called lockup at 6:15 or 6:30 every night, where they would lock your house, and I would have to climb out of my window to go get Indian food on the Eton High Street. So that made me kind of subversive and defiant of authority, which for a writer, actually for a journalist, is a very good thing, because you kind of want to be an outsider who's a little disrespectful of authority, who questions everything. So weirdly, being in a slightly oppressive boarding school was very helpful training for a writer. And at the same time, I had incredible teachers, unbelievable English teachers. And so that was very beneficial for a writer and for life. Then I went to Oxford, where, as I said, I just studied literature very intensely. So that was beautiful. And it was such a beautiful place. Like I was in a 750-year-old college, and it was just really gorgeous. And then I moved to New York when I was about 21, and New York just felt free. And so after all of the constraints of English society, where you felt this class system and you felt everyone watching you, and it was kind of smaller, and people, it was quite oppressive for a writer, for me, because so much of writing, especially in those early days, was being unproductive, failing, not really knowing what you were doing. You'd write a screenplay and it wouldn't work. And then you'd try to write a novel and it wouldn't work. And then, you'd make a proposal for a nonfiction book and you'd get an amazing agent, and then the publisher would reject it. And so a lot of it was kind of flailing around, and having people watch you flail around was really hard. And then when I was in New York, it just felt free. It was an amazing environment in which to become a writer, and I love food and I love music, and the fact that I could go out and see Dizzy Gillespie play and be 6 feet in front of Dizzy Gillespie, it was just an amazing thing. And then I could go to Carnegie Deli at 2 or 3 in the morning and get the soup that my grandmother used to make me, chicken soup with crackluch and matzo balls and stuff like that. It was just an amazing thing. So I loved New York, and it just felt free and open. And everything is possible in New York. And so even though it's a less nice city in many ways than London, it was just I still love it. It's still a wonderfully free city, and with an incredible concentration of human capital, just such talented people from every profession. And then, so I became a magazine writer for years. So I would work for places like Forbes and Fortune and Money and Time, and I moved to Hong Kong for Time magazine, and I became the deputy editor of the Asian edition of Time, and later the editor of the Asian edition of Time. And so I was based in Hong Kong. We had reporters all over Asia. So everywhere from, mainland China to India and Pakistan. And you'd send reporters off to North Korea, and they would send in their stories, and you would edit them in Hong Kong. And I traveled a lot. So I traveled to maybe 15 countries while I was there. So that was an incredibly enriching experience, and intense as well, because you work at a magazine like Time, and it's weekly, and so it's super intense. So there's no safety net. So you have to develop some real skills. So the people I worked with there were just unbelievably talented, whether it was as writers, designers, reporters, and I remember I had a colleague called Alex Perry, and I remember once being on he was a war reporter who sort of made his name during the war in Afghanistan, and I remember once being on the phone with him, and he had a very posh English accent, and he said, "Yeah, well, I'm just in a killing field here," and so you have these amazing experiences where you're talking to these extraordinary people. I had someone called Aravind Adiga, who won the Booker Prize for his first novel, The White Tiger, which is an immensely successful novel. And I would get to hire, before he became a novelist, I would get to send Aravind, this unbelievable writer who moved to India to work for Time. I would get to send him to cover the tsunami, for example. And so he would go off to Sri Lanka, or, amazing writers. So in a way, you look back on your career, and it kind of makes sense. Like there's a sort of inevitability where one thing led to another, and you developed this skill and that skill, and you met these people, and this interest developed. But while you're in it, none of it really makes much sense, and you have no idea where it's leading. And so there's this strange process, I think, when you're kind of constructing your career, where you sort of have a vague idea sometimes of what a target-rich area might be. You think, well, if I do that and I develop this skill, or I move to New York, or I move to Hong Kong or something, it's likely to open more doors than it closes, but you really have no idea what's going to lead to anything. And so I think if there's any takeaway, I sort of stopped planning at a certain point, because I realized all of my planning was kind of wrong anyway. Nothing happened the way I expected it. It's all been kind of extraordinary and kind of unexpected, and my predictive powers were terrible the whole way through. And so much of it has been based on relationships. So for example, I remember once having lunch in the dining room at Time Inc., which was the biggest magazine company in the world at that point. And I was having lunch with a friend of mine called Nick Piketty, who we used to call the Vortal, because he was this vertical portal who just knew everybody. He was a very charming guy. And as we're having lunch, he said, "Oh, my friend just became editor of the Asian edition of Time. He just got promoted." And I said, "So who's replacing him as deputy?" And he said, "I don't know." And I said, "Can you introduce me to him?" And so if it hadn't been for that lunch, I would never have moved to Asia, and my whole life would have been totally different. Wow. And so I think there's a kind of, whether you regard it as random or whether you regard it as kind of, the universe or the creator or whatever you think, fate is moving you around in some way. You look back and it's kind of miraculous what led to what. And so I've become increasingly mystical about these things, and I sort of feel like, wow, there's this extraordinary process that's unfolding here.
Sure.
And so I don't have any empirical evidence for this, but I increasingly kind of let go and just think, what the hell do I know? With my pea-sized brain, trying to crunch all of the complexity of life. So I sort of let go, and it's a funny thing, because I spend so much of my time trying to write about the world's most rational people, and then in some way with my own decision making, it's almost totally intuitive. It's almost totally just me thinking. When I decided to do this podcast, I talked to Stig Brodersen, who had set up the Investors Podcast Network, and I got some advice from him, and I just sort of thought, Stig's a really lovely guy. Mm-hmm. And I really like him. He'd be a nice person to partner with.
Yeah.
I didn't really do much due diligence. I didn't, I like talked to a couple of people, but I was like, okay, I'll do that. And I sort of feel like my intuitive decisions have probably worked better than a lot of my like hyper rational ones where I was like agonized over it. So I don't know. I'm not recommending that anyone else follow my example, but I do think there's a sense in which however much you plan your life, it's so unexpected. So much of what happens that it goes to something that Howard Marks, this legendary investor, once said to me, where he talked about how you can't predict the future, so you have to prepare for it, and then you have to accommodate yourself to reality as it is. So you can't kind of pretend to yourself that it's a different way. Time Inc. fell apart as a magazine company.
Yes, it did.
And people like me had to adjust to that. I couldn't say, but I still want to work at Time magazine. I had to look at the fact that they were laying all of us off, or a lot of us off at that time during the financial crisis, and be like, okay, so how do I accommodate myself to reality as it is? So I think as for our listeners, as they're thinking about how to construct their own lives, I do think you want to point yourself in target-rich areas. You look at something and you think, if I develop this skill, or I move to this place, or I work for this sort of company or this sort of person, I'm going to develop some really helpful skills, some really interesting contacts. It's a target-rich area. Good stuff is likely to come from it. But then you have to have this adaptability where you're like, I'm going to let go and kind of trust that it's going to work out well. So you kind of create the conditions for success while knowing that you're not really in control ultimately. You can fool yourself into thinking you're in control, but there's something going on that's much more mysterious.
There is. And for what you just said, it's interesting. As you were saying that, again, I've been doing what I'm doing for, I think, 12, 15 years, something like that. Dad brain is jarring me with the approximate number. But regardless, over time, the more you succeed in anything, naturally it's more intuitive because, let's face it, you don't have to think about the checks and balances. You've done it so much where it becomes... it's the definition of intuitive. And it is kind of ironic because you have interviewed arguably some of the most rational, maybe hyper-rational humans of all time. But even then, you ask them certain investment questions and they'll just kind of look at you and they don't know how to answer it because it's so ingrained, their processes and procedures, where they've probably in a lot of ways stopped thinking about that. And kind of going onto that topic, because I have so many questions on the book. One of my favorite quotes that you had in the book in Investing in Life, I'm going to read it verbatim. Quote, "As I've come to realize, it's helpful to view investing in life as games in which we must consciously and consistently seek to maximize our odds of success." End quote. Now, for you personally, what would be the one area where you've done the best at just that? And more importantly, what would be an area that you are either continuously working towards or have struggled with in that area the most?
Well, so if you think about this idea of consciously and consistently stacking the odds in your favor, that's in some ways the master principle underneath the book, right? It's there is a lot of randomness and luck built into the world. It's very uncertain, but there are ways in which you can behave that are more likely to stack the odds in your favor. So think about what's been going on recently in the markets, where in the last few days we've seen banks failing. In the last few months, we've seen things like cryptocurrencies or overvalued tech stocks getting crushed.
Sure.
So you could stack the odds in your favor as an investor by saying, let me diversify. Let me not get carried away. Let me assume that we're living in an uncertain world where banks go bankrupt, where bad things happen, where things that are overheated, that everyone is chasing after,
Sure,
suddenly go wrong. So although I don't know what the future holds, if I diversify, if I don't chase after fads in a crazy way and put all of my money in one overheated asset, I'm more likely to have a good outcome. Likewise, if I don't, one thing I mention in the book at one point is I say, if you have all of your money in one country, one currency, one bank, one institution, with one investor, in one fund, you're kind of playing, or one asset class, you're playing with a loaded gun. And you might be fine, but there's a beautiful line from Nassim Taleb in one of his books. He wrote this great book, Fooled by Randomness. In one of his books, he says, the fragile breaks with time. And so when you do something that brings fragility to your life, like putting all of your money in one fairly young bank in Silicon Valley, you might be fine. But if you do a lot of things like that, over time, the fragile breaks. And so I think that's a really good practical example of how you stack the odds in your favor. By simply being aware of a principle like that the future is uncertain, so let me build in a margin of safety by diversifying a bit, not putting all my eggs in one basket, not assuming that whatever has been successful is going to continue to be successful. So just because the US market has been great over the last, century, basically, with this massive upward rise. I mean, in the 1920s or 30s, the Dow was, under 100. It's been an extraordinary rise. That doesn't have to continue. I mean, there's good reason to think that it will continue, but I think you still want to invest abroad because you want to diversify. So that's a very simple way of stacking the odds in your favor. But then the other question that you asked, if I remember correctly, where you asked, is there something else where I'm trying to shift so that I somewhere that I've not been so good about doing this that I'm trying to work on?
Yes.
One of the most critical things that we should probably talk about at more length is that you need to have equanimity, both in investing and life. You need somehow to structure your life so that you're building equanimity, so that you have peace of mind, so that in the midst of this maelstrom of everything that's going on in the markets, in your family, in your political system, in your community, with the environment, with the geopolitical system, somehow amid the storm, you want to be a kind of, as much as possible, kind of peaceful in the eye of the storm. And increasingly, I think I've realized just how crucial that is for investors, but also how crucial that is in every area of life. So I think for our listeners, the key is to say, okay, so if I'm going to have a happy and successful life and be productive, and be a good parent, be a good child, be a good friend, be a good employee, be a good employer, I'm going to have to invest in becoming more equanimous, becoming calmer, becoming. It's very rare for me to get to use the word equanimous, and so I do it with some trepidation, knowing how pretentious it sounds. But I think you have to think very seriously about how you're going to build equanimity, and so that requires you to think about the things that have worked for you in the past. So, is it meditation? Is it exercise? Is it not drinking too much and going to sleep earlier? Is it hanging out with a certain type of person who doesn't make you crazy and behave poorly? Is it reading certain books that ground you and make you think more philosophically and more spiritually? Is it going to the Berkshire Hathaway annual meeting in Omaha every year so that you're hanging out with people who are thinking in a very calm, long-term, counter-cyclical way. They're not just chasing the latest fad. So I think you want to think about how to construct your ecosystem in every way so that it promotes calmness and equanimity. And that, to me, in the past, I would have regarded that as a little bit of a digression. I would have thought, if I just hustle, I keep working like crazy, and I'm just really intense, and I just harness my anxiety and my fear of failure and my terror of mediocrity and my terror of letting people down, I'm going to be successful. And I think to some extent that was true. I did manage to harness those sort of negative emotions in ways that were very helpful to me in terms of getting ahead. But I don't think they make you very happy. They don't give you peace of mind. And so increasingly now, I think very seriously about things like meditation and who I'm hanging out with, what I read. And I feel guilty about it sometimes. Like I got up this morning and I sat in this armchair behind me and I had coffee and I read a kind of esoteric book by a great Tibetan Lama, a great meditation master. And I probably spent half an hour reading that book, and then I ran out of time to do my meditation, but I did kind of a morning connection where I say a few, I study Kabbalah, which is this ancient form of mysticism, and I did a few prayers, and I don't know, I sort of feel a bit guilty about it, and then I'm like, yeah, but actually it's kind of grounding me, like the particular, prayer or meditation, these are all ways of putting your mind in a particular place. So it's very personal. I'm not saying other people should do what I do, but I think, if you're, let's say, for example, I mean, again, I'm totally not saying this to be a proselytizer, but, one of the things I did before we started to talk, there's a particular ancient Hebrew prayer that keeps repeating the word emet, which means truth in Hebrew. And so as you do it, you're asking to be a conduit for truth in some way and to connect with truth. And so just pounding into your head almost every day by doing that particular prayer that you want to connect with truth and truthfulness, it's a way of putting your head in a particular place. So I don't know, I mean, look, I believe in God and stuff, but there have been times in my life where I didn't believe in God. So who knows, I mean, look, none of these things are provable. But I think if I'm directing my attention towards things like truthfulness, or I'm trying to say, literally before I do my morning connection, I'm saying things to myself like, okay, let me try to be more loving, kinder, and more compassionate. And so I don't know, maybe I'm just talking to the better part of my personality, because there are plenty of times where I behave really lousily. And so, but by repeating that every day, let me be a channel for compassion or oneness instead of fragmentation and separation. That's really important. That's where you're putting your mind.
Well, in one of the things that you brought up, going back to at the beginning, and it was funny because when you were saying, diversify, which is important. I personally think it can get a little overused, but there is merit to it. I was laughing to myself a little bit because one of the questions I was going to ask you was, in one of your chapters, you follow arguably one of my favorite investors, Monish Pabrai, who, if you Google anti-diversification, I would say he's like top 10, right? Like very concentrated in his efforts, all of that good stuff. And aside from investing, one of the things that struck me profoundly was you were mentioning on the sign of one of his walls in his foundation, Doc Shauna's classrooms, so long as you have faith in you, nothing will be able to abstract you. And I was thinking about you with this because in journalism, in writing, just doing some research on it before we had this discussion today, it is a very volatile environment. And like you said, at time, every week, I mean, you are up against deadline after deadline after deadline. And so I can only imagine what that was like for you as far as turbulence. And so what were some of the moments in your career, or have been the moments in your career, where you wish you had heard that quote earlier, or you looked toward this quote to lean on it through your tougher times?
Well, actually, it's funny that you pick up on that quote, because it's something that was in a classroom in India on the wall, and part of the reason why I quoted it is that it's sort of like the grammar is kind of garbled.
Yes.
And so part of the comedy of it as a writer was the fact that it's sort of poetic, and it's in an educational environment, but it's grammatically wrong.
Yes.
And so there's some, nothing will be able to abstract you. I mean, there's something that's like, I think they meant distract you, but they said abstract you. And so part of it is actually just the love of detail and the comedy of life. Like that in trying to educate these kids in this very earnest, beautiful way, they end up misusing language, but actually their misuse of language is kind of poetic and lovely. Mm-hmm. But this whole question of distraction and focus is a really critical one. How you maintain focus, and this is something not surprisingly that the great investors are extraordinary at. And so, one of the things that I've observed from someone like Monish Pabrai, who you mentioned, is that he's very ruthless about structuring his life in a way that allows him to do what he does to the best of his capability. And so Monish, for example, he doesn't really like talking to shareholders or prospective shareholders in his fund. Like, he's happy to have an annual meeting where everyone comes and he entertains them, and he's very funny and he's charming and he makes a good time for them all. But if one of the investors, or a prospective investor is like, I'm going to invest $10 million or $20 million or whatever, but I need to meet with you once a quarter or something to discuss it, Monish's like, no, sorry, not interested. And that's an extraordinary thing, that he's prepared to forego fees, millions of dollars in fees, because he's not prepared to do what he calls the whole mumbo jumbo of marketing. Mm-hmm. I don't enjoy all of that mumbo jumbo. And he thinks in some way it would be undemocratic to give extra attention to one shareholder just because they're rich and want more of his time, or because it's an institution and they have to have more of his time. He's like, no, you don't have any advantage over the other shareholders who get to come and talk to me once a year at the annual meeting. And so there's something kind of beautiful about that. It's sort of antisocial and sort of tough,
yeah,
and at the same time kind of wonderful. Another thing Monish said to me, he said, look, if I have lunch with someone and I don't enjoy lunch, I'll say to myself after it, did I enjoy lunch with that person? And he said, if not, there will never be another lunch with that person. Mm-hmm. And so there's something kind of, again, brutally honest and pragmatic about removing unnecessary complexity from his life, making sure that he's hanging out with people who he regards as a good influence on him. He'll say to himself, is the person I'm meeting is a relationship with this person going to increase the odds that I behave well, or is it going to increase the odds that I behave poorly? And so again, there's a kind of stacking of the odds by deciding who he's going to hang out with. And part of this comes from this famous lunch that he and my friend Guy Spear had with Warren Buffett back in 2009, where they paid $650,100 to charity to have this lunch with Buffett. And Buffett said to them during this lunch at Smith & Wollensky, this steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan, he said, hang out with people who are better than you, and you can't help but improve. And so this is one of the things that is an amazing distillation of practical wisdom over the life of someone like Buffett, to figure out the environment in which I place myself is going to have a profound influence on my own behavior. So let me choose my environment very carefully. Sure. And this goes back, there's an amazing Kabbalist, this great sage, Rav Ashlag, who died decades ago, who said, you have to be very careful in choosing your environment, because you think that you're going to change your environment, but your environment is going to change you. And I've thought about that a lot. Like when you're trying to decide where to work or who to work for, you want to work for people who are upstanding and honorable. It's really important. And likewise, think about Charlie Munger, Buffett's genius, polymathic 99-year-old partner. Munger talks about hanging out with the eminent dead. So he says you not only want to choose who you're hanging out with in person, you want to choose to hang out with great members of the eminent dead by reading certain books about people who are wise. And so, in a way, if you start, Munger calls himself a biography nut, right? So he's obsessed with someone like Ben Franklin. He's obsessed with Darwin. He's obsessed with Einstein. So he's looking at someone like Darwin, and he says, well, here's a guy who is very, very religious, and he was from a very religious culture, right? I mean, it was a time when there was, it was conventional to have certain beliefs. And as he studies nature and figures out his thoughts on evolution, he has to decide, well, if I publish these ideas, they run counter to a lot of the orthodox conventional opinion of my time. And he was prepared to do that, despite the fact that it was that these findings went against his own devoutly held beliefs. And so Munger looks at something like that and says that's the mindset that we need as investors and in life, to be constantly challenging your own most cherished beliefs. So you think about something like a devout belief in Bitcoin or something like that. I'm agnostic about Bitcoin. What do I know?
Sure.
But at the very least, I remember at one point a year or two ago, you'd have people sort of saying, I've got 120% of my net worth in Bitcoin. I'm leveraged. And I would be like, at least challenge your belief. Like look at it and say, why could I be wrong? And so this is very much the kind of falsification mindset that people like Munger learned from Einstein or Darwin or Richard Feynman, these great scientists who would ask themselves, well, why might I be wrong? And Munger consciously structures his own intellectual life this way. So he for example, he's traditionally a Republican, but he's voted Democrat multiple times, and he doesn't particularly agree with Paul Krugman, this Nobel Prize winning economist who's a columnist at the New York Times, but he thinks he's very smart and a very good writer. So he pushes himself to read this guy who he doesn't agree with. And so this habit of seeking out what Munger would call disconfirming evidence is an incredibly powerful habit of mind. And again, this is something where you're stacking the odds in your favor, both in investing and in life, by saying, why could I be wrong? What's the other side of this? Like, why should I assume that I have some kind of monopoly on the truth? Like, maybe Bitcoin is the greatest investment of all time. Maybe it's terrible and it's a total disaster and there's nothing there. And let me look at the evidence. Right. And I've spent a lot of time over the years interviewing Bill Miller, who's one of the greatest investors of our time.
Oh, yes.
And I saw him in New York a couple of weeks ago, and I was asking him about Bitcoin. And Bill has had a massive position in Bitcoin. And I was asking him, and he started buying at $200 or $300 per coin. So he's up massively, right? His average price was about $500 per coin. So it's he was a very early believer in it. And Bill used to be in military intelligence. He started out his career. He was a philosophy PhD student at Johns Hopkins, and recently gave $75 million to the philosophy department there, and then became an intelligence analyst. So his training as a philosopher and as an intelligence analyst is to be totally objective in the way he analyzes information. So when I would say to him, well, people like Buffett and Munger say that Bitcoin is rat poison squared. He's like, okay, well, let me look at the evidence for that. And he's like, well, why should I believe that this 92-year-old and 99-year-old guy who don't have any domain expertise in technology, why should I believe them? What credibility do they have in this particular area? They're geniuses, and I admire them tremendously. But are they credible sources on this? And so he's just looking at the evidence in this sort of objective way and questioning himself. And likewise, Munger says, any year in which you don't destroy one of your most cherished beliefs is a wasted year. So that ability just to be humble and constantly be looking at your own cherished beliefs and saying, yeah, and what if I'm wrong? And that's really helpful as an investor, because then you can say, well, so I'm staking all of my future on these tech stocks that everybody loves that have been going up, like Peloton and Zoom and Snowflake and Roku and Netflix and Spotify. Everyone's getting so rich off them. And you look at them and you say, well, okay, so maybe it's a new paradigm, and maybe something has changed, and maybe I'm missing something, and let me study this. And then you look at them and you say, yeah, but I also know from studying value investing that valuation matters. And how expensive are these things? And if they're really expensive, is it sustainable? And so you're just looking at the evidence in an objective way. And then you're saying, given that I'm liable to be wrong, let me at least hedge so that if I'm wrong, I'm going to survive. And that's a really crucial lesson, right? You're constantly saying to yourself, there's a famous bond investor called Jeff Gundlach, who's often described as the bond king, who, when I interviewed him, he managed something like $140 billion in assets. And Gundlach said to me, look, I'm wrong about a third of the time. So he said, the question I have to ask myself is, what's the consequence if I'm wrong? So you have to say to yourself, if I've got all of my money in this bank in Silicon Valley and I'm wrong, what's the consequence? And if I have all my money in tech stocks, or all my money in cryptocurrencies, or all my money just in the US, or all my money with one fund manager, or one advisor, or one in one currency, what if I'm wrong? What if you were living in Germany during World War II, or France when it was invaded, or Cuba when the market shut down? You just have to say, the world is a very strange place, and I, with my peanut-sized brain, don't see everything. Let me be humble and prepare for an uncertain future by just diversifying a little bit and acknowledging the fact that I can be wrong.
Well, I can tell you, if you have a peanut-sized brain, a lot of us are very, very, very screwed. Now, one thing you mentioned earlier, and I love the story that you mentioned with Monish regarding him asking after lunch or a gathering if I ever want to see this person again. And it's funny you bring that up, because I've actually would have been trying to get him on the show, but I've been very anxious, and I don't get starstruck at all. I really don't. But I've been anxious to reach out to him, not because I don't think he'd be great, but I thought in the back of my head, oh man, if I never hear from him again, right? Like that is like the kiss of death. But one thing that I admire about him is just how, I think most people would think it's almost like a selfish arrogance. It's not. He's just very fact of the matter. And he's also very calm. And one thing that fascinates me actually about you is your calm demeanor. And I say that because whether you're a journalist, an author, again, I know what it's like to be an author, but being a journalist, I'm an outsider. And we went over this a little earlier, how it's a very volatile and stressful world. And so, and it can be all consuming, emotionally draining. That spars into everything else in one's life. And I was thinking about it because you've had this blessing of interviewing all these amazing investors, super investors, and they have extreme patience. And I guess my question is for you, was that one of the subconscious lures of interviewing these people and spending time with them in a way, like living vicariously through them?
I think one of the things that I realized while I was writing Richer, Wiser, Happier, maybe several years into the project, because I took a ridiculous amount of time writing it. I mean,
It took like 5 years, right?
5 years, yeah. And I didn't even take a vacation, and I worked most Sundays. I mean, I was very much in this cave on my own, trying to work through these ideas. But one thing that I think I realized in retrospect was I was very drawn to these idiosyncratic maverick figures who, in a sense, were they were code breakers, they were puzzle solvers, and so they were looking at the game of markets and looking at the game of life in an incredibly independent spirit, and cracking the code and deciding, well, this is how I win this game. This is how I should structure my life so I can be productive. This is what constitutes a happy and abundant life. So here's how I stack the odds in my favor, and here's how I create a life that's authentic to me, and that plays to my strengths. And I think because I was kind of very subversive and independent-minded in my own character, which I think is probably helpful as a writer, because you're kind of an outsider, you're questioning everything. And so the same personality that led me to climb out of my window at Eton as a 15-year-old, and I would literally, there was one phone in my house of 50 boys or whatever, and I would phone the Indian restaurant and order my chicken tikka and naan, and then I would climb out of my window, and I would go up to the high street, even though you would be, you'd be in real trouble if you got caught, because I really cared about food, and I couldn't stand the terrible food in the house. And so I wasn't doing drugs or drinking or anything like that, but I really cared about food. And so I was always just I was very independent spirited, and I didn't like authority. I didn't like people telling me what to do. And so I think when I looked at the great investors, most of the ones I focus on are these very independent mavericks. And the beauty of it is that because they're such good thinkers, they've managed to create the wealth that enables them to structure their lives the way they want. And so I think what I gradually realized that you got from the money was not so much the planes and the yachts and the mansions and the like. The really valuable thing was the independence. And this is something that Monish learned from Charlie Munger, because Monish has become very close to Charlie over the years. And Monish once said to me, look, Charlie always says the real thing that we got out of the money was independence. So we wouldn't be subordinate to some, annoying dictatorial boss or whatever. And Monish said, yeah, that's true. That's what it's given me as well, the independence. And, I haven't been to Monish's house in Texas yet. He moved to Texas in the last couple of years. But I see the pictures of it, and it's beautiful and has an infinity pool and stuff like that. And, he did used to drive a Ferrari after making enormous amounts of money on Ferrari stock. Although I think he sold the Ferrari and got like a truck or something. Mm-hmm. He was telling me last year, like not
because he wanted to feel like a Texan. I think that was the quote.
Exactly. Yeah. But he does have some beautiful things, and he lives very well, and he eats in great restaurants and stuff. But the really valuable thing is the fact that he's totally free to structure his time and his life the way he chooses. And Bill Miller says the same thing. Bill Miller talks about how he has total control over the content of his time. And so Bill, again, he's doing what he wants, and he works with people he likes. I mean, he just retired, and so now he's going to be managing his own money. Yeah. But the last 20 years, he's worked alongside Samantha Macklemore, who I just interviewed for my podcast. That'll come out soon.
Awesome.
And he's worked with his son, Bill the Fourth. That's kind of lovely. I guess for a while he worked at, for a long time he worked at Legg Mason, and that was a big institutional public company. But later when he set up his own company, mm-hmm. That was where he was working with his son and with Samantha Macklemore. And I think that's pretty telling that he he became increasingly independent. And now this last stage of just managing his own fortune, it's a move even further in the direction of independence. And that tells you something, I think, that someone as wise and thoughtful as Bill is becoming more and more independent with age.
Well, and he's also very real. So we had Robert Hagstrom on the show last year who worked with Bill Miller. And Bill, it's funny because his son is Bill Miller the Fourth. But without knowing Bill, I feel like Bill would appreciate it if he just called Bill Miller the fourth Bill, right? It's just because he's very real. And it's the same thing with Monish. You mentioned with the independence with wealth. I mean, one of my favorite quotes from Charlie Munger is, "My goal was never to get rich. My goal was just to become independent, and I overshot." And there was also a quote by Monish, I think talking to you, where you were dealing with, and this, my brain is a little foggy here, but you were dealing with either, I don't know if you'd call it a client or someone that you're writing a story for, and they were just a pain in the butt. And Monish basically told you, like, if you were wealthy, you just wouldn't put up with that. And I thought, man, like, again, kind of the cockiness, arrogant side of it, but again, just extremely rational. Now, this isn't turning into the Monish show. I have one more question, and then we're going to move on from him, because you've written about a ton. But
but before you go there, that's an important point. That what he was saying is, if I had been richer, I could just have said to this guy, "To hell with you," and moved on. And so one of the things that's happened is, because I've saved and I've invested and I've lived within my means and I've worked hard, and been very fortunate, I still don't think I'm totally home free and like have no worries about money or anything, but I don't work with people I don't like. And that's one of the key lessons from that experience, is to get to a point where I could say, I'm not going to do work that I don't like for people that I don't like. And so that's a very idiosyncratic decision. But for me, I really think hard about what I'm optimizing for, and I'm not optimizing for money. I'm optimizing for things like peace of mind, happiness, fulfilling work. And so I spoke to someone yesterday who's a very successful money manager who was asking me, if I would work on something with him. And I'll think about it. And I spent an hour chatting with him yesterday. And one reason why I would consider it is he seems like a really nice bloke. And that's critical to me. And if he wasn't nice, it would just be an absolute non-starter. And so I think if there's a really important takeaway for our listeners, it's to really ask yourself seriously what it is you're optimizing for. Like, what do you care about most? And so for me, I don't need a grand home. I mean, I have like probably an 8 or 9 year old Honda CRV, and I'm starting to think I should replace it. Not because, I literally never once taken it to get washed. Every couple of years, or every 6 months or so, my wife or kids will get embarrassed and they'll take it to get washed for me. I've never once got it washed. And so I don't really care how it looks or how people think of me. I'm thinking of getting the new hybrid, because I'm just like, it's probably got all these safety features that, given that I'm not that good a driver, it would be good to have. And then I'm like, I wonder how good the stereo is. And so I'm really not thinking of like the flashiness of it. I'm thinking of like, how good will my music sound in there?
Yes.
And does it have good safety features? And is the seat kind of comfy? And so you need enough self-awareness to really think through these issues of what constitutes a happy and abundant life for you, and then to structure things around that. And it's easier for people who are very wealthy to do that. But on the other hand, having a smaller home. My home is not grand, but it's very nice, and I have beautiful books. I never hold back on buying books. Like, if there's a book that I think might be interesting, I buy it. And likewise with my kids, they can buy any books they want. Even if I have them already, they can buy them. And so that's just important to me. And so really I think what you're trying to do in emulating the greatest investors is actually to build a life that's more and more true to who you are. That's the real prize.
Capitalizers, this episode is sponsored by the best-selling book, Capitalize Your Finances, the how-to framework that takes you from compoundingly clueless to monetarily magnificent. Regardless of where you're at in your financial life, whether you're just beginning to express interest and commitment to your personal finances, at the pinnacle of your career, winding down into retirement, or thinking about your legacy for future generations, this book walks you through every step of the way so you can succeed on your terms and with your own values and passions guiding you. After reading this book, you will officially have Christopher A. Panayotou, the Cap in Capitalize, in your back pocket, guiding you in detail through every step of the way so that you can take charge of your finances, not the other way around. Head on over to Amazon.com today and start capitalizing your finances to the fullest with this incredible book, Capitalize Your Finances, the how-to financial framework that takes you from compoundingly clueless to monetarily magnificent. And now, back to the episode.
Well, in as far as, because we talk about the investing side all the time, and for you, one thing that's been interesting, and I tried looking up interviews with you, and a lot of people don't like to ask what's made you a better author and a better journalist, because I think that provides a lot more value than what most people are asking, because let's face it, once one or two or three people ask you the same thing, it's a different flavor, but you're leaving Baskin and Robbins with ice cream, so to speak. And one thing that came to my mind, and I was uber curious about this, is, Monish is all about being a shameless cloner. And this is where we're moving on from Monish, okay? But for you, like for your journalist capabilities and your writing capabilities, because I look up to you as an author as well, who have been the people that you have cloned and taken the best traits from to combine what we know today as an author?
Thanks. Well, I've read an enormous amount of fiction, so that's key because it's all storytelling, and so everything for me, every section of a book, when I write it, I see it as a story. It's always a story. So even if I'm So if you think of something like the start of my chapter on Howard Marks, which has come to my mind kind of randomly, it's a chapter that's really about the fact that everything changes, which is this fundamental Buddhist observation, right? That everything is impermanent, everything is changing constantly, the future is unknowable, and yet we have to make decisions about the future. So there's a theme underlying it. But it starts, the chapter, as I remember it, with Howard Marks as a young student going to Wharton and wanting to sign up for an art class. And they say to him, this class is oversubscribed. We got to get rid of some people. And the professor says, tell me what your name is and what your major is. And so Howard Marks, Wharton School of Finance. And the guy says, right, you're the first one out. And so he chucks Howard out. And I say, evicted from Eden, he has to go figure out like what other class to pursue. And so he to his surprise, he stumbles into this Japanese studies class, and he discovers this concept of mujo, which is all about impermanence, the fact that everything changes, this Zen Japanese term for impermanence and change. And so he takes that idea, and that idea is what ends up making him a multi-billionaire. That because he sees impermanence and change in the markets, and he figures out ways to accommodate himself to the changes in the market in this kind of counter-cyclical way that's made him enormously successful. So that chapter, this is just one example of how, for me, you make it a story. Mm-hmm. It's always a story. And so it engages you because you think about him as the underdog. So it's very relatable. So I don't know, is that coming from all those years of watching movies or reading Dickens novels where there's an underdog who's, cast out. Then at the same time, to write something like, to describe that scene and use a phrase like evicted from Eden, that's playful, right?
Right.
That's me kind of having fun and joking around. And it's also, it's probably in some weird way influenced by the fact that I read Milton's Paradise Lost when I was at college, 35 years ago or something like that. So there are all of these influences going into things that you do, but it's all storytelling. And then when I started to write the book, when I was actually planning the book, I was very consciously going to look at people like Malcolm Gladwell, Atul Gawande, Michael Lewis, and Oliver Sacks. So these great nonfiction writers. And I was really carefully deconstructing their books. And I would be like, okay, how many pages is a chapter in a book like The Tipping Point by Gladwell? How many sections is it? How come his sections are numbered? Why do I want a number in between sections? Why don't I have a section title? Like I can have fun with section titles. So I can be like having playful headlines in between sections. So I'm taking stuff. So I'm looking at how he breaks up sections and how he breaks up chapters. And then I'm like, no, but I don't want to do it quite that way. So I'm going to add this other thing from somebody else or something that I've done. I've done that since I was probably 23 as a journalist, had headline, like it's called a section head. Like it's a title between the sections. So it's a little more playful than just having a number. One of the things that Gladwell is brilliant at is taking an idea, like the idea of the tipping point, and then finding all of these variations on a theme, all of these different people and companies that illustrate it. So he would take Sesame Street, and he'd be like, how did Sesame Street become so popular? And that would be an example of the tipping point. So I'm looking at my book, and I'm like, okay, so what's really the central theme here? Well, in some ways, the central theme is how do you learn from the greatest investors how to stack the odds in your favor in every area of life, both in markets and life. So then I'm like, okay, so I don't really have one central theme in the way of the tipping point or Blink or one of those books of Gladwell's. In a way, every chapter of mine is a separate theme. And so in a way, I'm writing like 11 books, which is really hard and kind of insane and maniacal. But they all in some way are about stacking the odds in your favor. So I was very carefully reverse engineering what people who'd already figured out how to do this had done, and then trying to find the best of what they did. And when I interviewed Tom Gaynor, the CEO of Markel, who's a great investor and very wise person, I said to him, what do you make of Monish's idea of cloning, of basically reverse engineering what people who are smarter and wiser than us have already figured out, and then replicating it with this fierce attention to detail? And I said this because in some ways Markel is a cloned company. Mm-hmm. It's a smaller clone of Berkshire Hathaway. Yes. And so it's this brilliant exercise in cloning. And Tom, who's a very mild-mannered, lovely, self-effacing, humorous guy, didn't like the term cloning because it seems kind of pejorative, almost like demeaning. And he said, what you're really doing is you're recombining things in a way that suits your own circumstances. And so in a sense, that's what I was doing. I was taking things that I could see from other writers, and I was recombining them in ways that suited my circumstances. And it becomes true to you in some strange way. So even while you're trying to replicate what other people have figured out, it ends up being true to you because it's sort of permeated with your own character and idiosyncrasies and weirdnesses. And so I think, again, if there's any kind of takeaway here for our listeners, it's that you want to go through life very consciously reverse engineering things that people have done that seem really smart and take advantage of the low-hanging fruit here by ripping off things that are easy to replicate. But then at the same time, you're also having to do it in a way that's true to your own personality. So for Monish, it makes sense to replicate, say, Munger's belief in extreme concentration in a few stocks. For me, that doesn't really work because I don't have Monish's temperament. I'm much more fearful than he is. And so for me to have all of my money in a handful of stocks, A, doesn't suit my temperament, but B, doesn't actually suit my talents. I'm not good enough to do that. I'm not smart enough to do that. I'm not diligent enough about the stocks to do that. And so part of it is you're simultaneously learning from the people who figured stuff out, who are smarter than you. Like, figure out what Jack Bogle discovered about the powers of indexing. Like, study Bogle, because he was really smart and really wise. Mm-hmm. And figure out what Joel Greenblatt discovered about how to pick stocks, about what makes for a successful business. But then you have to recombine these things in a way that's true to your personality. And that goes for everything, not just investing, but how to live, how to meditate, how to treat your kids. You'll often hear people talk about how to raise their kids. Yeah, I'm not going to do it that way. I remember how people would have a set bedtime for their kids, and it's like, it's so clearly smart, right? And they would have all of these rules, and it's like, we never had any rules for our kids. We basically, we're two writers, and we had kids, and we were basically like, the one rule is be kind to each other. Yes. And that was it. And so as a result, I mean, some of this is nature and some of it's nurture. Henry and Madeline, our kids, they are not particularly disciplined and linear. They're incredibly creative, very loving, very compassionate, very kind. They have a good relationship with each other, thank God. Like, they're very kind to each other. And I don't really, in my own life, I don't really value rules that much. And surprise, surprise,
yeah.
they internalize that from us.
Yeah, I mean, definitely surprise, surprise. And you already answered, it's interesting, you answered one of my questions that I was going to ask you regarding Howard Marks. One of his lines that struck me was the first rule of the road is to be honest with ourselves about our limitations and vulnerabilities. And I was going to ask you, why haven't you started your own fund or investment team or whatever? But you just
precisely that. I understand my limitations.
Yeah.
And I mean, Howard likes to quote. I think he quoted this in my interview with him on my podcast. He said, as Clint Eastwood would say, a man's got to know his limitations.
Yes.
And I have to know my limitations. And so there are certain things. Editing is very, very easy for me. It's like bizarrely easy to see someone else's writing and see what's wrong with it or see how it could be improved and raised a little. For me to look at a stock or a business and see the vulnerability, to see why the accounts how the accounts are concealing something, that does not play to my strengths. Yeah. And so one of the great lessons from the best investors, really is to play games that you're equipped to win. And this is a really crucial lesson in life, both professionally and in other areas of life. You want to pick games that you're suited to in terms of your temperament, you're suited to in terms of your talents, and you're deeply interested in. So for me, I mean, if I read you a couple of lines from the book that I had been reading this morning, you'd be like, really? That's what you're reading? Like, it's a really esoteric book about Tibetan Buddhism. And I've looked at two other books this morning. So it's, I haven't even had breakfast yet. There are 3 books within 3 feet of me here, and I've looked in all of them. I've read something from 3 different books. One is a 2,000-year-old book in Aramaic, One is from a Tibetan Buddhist, enlightened Lama, and one is from a guy called Rabbi Elimelech of Lizhensk, whose death anniversary it is today, who died probably in the 19th century.
Yes.
And so I sort of suddenly realized, oh, it's his death anniversary. Let me grab his book and see. And I open it randomly, and the page that I open it randomly to is about this week's portion of the Old Testament. And so I started reading that. And so I'm just naturally drawn towards books, towards reading, towards seeing patterns that may or may not exist.
Right.
Towards stories, ideas, abstract thinking, figuring out what makes people successful, what works and doesn't work in life. I'm not really drawn to numbers or sitting analyzing balance sheets. I can count to like 4.
And that's all you need, right? Actually, that's
Maybe.
twice as high that I can count. Well, and as far as one of the investors that I'm very jealous, I'll just say very jealous that you got to interview was Sir John Templeton. And one of his guiding principles is beware of emotion. And in investing, that's obviously very common knowledge. But what struck me was how, more so like I thought of how that struck you. And after reading your work, but more importantly, after our initial interaction, which I don't know if you remember, you were very under the weather, but you gave me the time of day. And in my mind, I'm thinking, we can reschedule this, right? But you just kept chugging. And I quickly realized, it took me about 30 seconds to realize how emotionally giving you are. And
Thank you.
And with your time, heart, effort, my question is this, because I struggle with this mightily. How do you balance the skill of mastering the art of giving your time and giving back versus knowing the more time concentrated on your venture or ventures at hand, the more your success will compound?
Yeah, not well. It's a constant source of stress for me. So I had someone trying to call me this morning to get advice on something, and he wants me to read something of his and help him with it. And I had to be like, sorry, I'm about to do this interview, and I've got another deadline, and it's very hard. It's very hard, and I'm not naturally good at structuring my time. I'm not linear in the way that I do things. I had a shower this morning. I'm like, all right, I'm going to go do my meditation. And then I'm like in the shower, and I'm like, oh, that's what I should write in my introduction to my podcast episode about Guy Spear. And so then I sit down, and then like an hour later, I missed my chance to do my meditation. And this is like all day long. It's like, so the skills that enable you to make weird connections between ideas and books and interviews, it's a very lateral kind of mind where you're constantly here and here and here and all over the place. And so the thing that's my strength is also my great weakness. Like, it's much harder for me to stick with processes and systems. And so figuring out that balance of how to manage your time, how to optimize your time, how to reduce complexity so that I can be productive and can do what I'm best at and what I'm most suited to, and figuring out how to respond to the circumstances that arise, like whether it's a sudden moment of inspiration about what to write, or whether it's somebody wants help, or that's just very, very hard for me. And so I think once I'm in something, once I'm doing it, once I'm in a conversation with someone, I'm very present, and I connect to them emotionally, and I'm reasonably empathetic, and I can detect their emotions and the like when I think about it. But it's hard for me to know this is where I should be. But I do have a fundamental underlying principle here that that guides me, which is I have this sense that I should be becoming more and more sharing, and that the more I can help other people, the better that is. And I think that's so again, it depends what you're trying to optimize for. I'm not necessarily trying to optimize for fame and money and power. It's important for me to share ideas that might help other people. Mm-hmm. And I can't quite explain why that is. But it's the same for Guy Spear as well. There's some aspect for Guy of wanting to teach and share ideas. And so when Guy does a podcast, I think there's some sense probably in the back of his mind, sort of far in the back of his mind, that it's good in terms of branding and asset management, asset gathering and stuff like that. But it's like 1% of his thinking. It's like really he's just there trying to be truthful and honest and share ideas. And likewise, I haven't thought for a second about like, will people buy my book if I'm on this podcast and talking about it? I'm not trying to frame it in a way that like, here's why you should go buy this book and read this chapter. It's like, if I can share a few ideas that might have an impact on somebody's life, then I'm happy to do it. And so there's a part of me that's like, if one person listens to the podcast and one idea, or if a few thousand people listen, but one idea has a profound impact on one person, that's very powerful. Like, I mean, there are people who've said things that, I mean, Taleb probably doesn't know that I exist, but I think about that idea that the fragile breaks with time very frequently. That's a very powerful insight that's helped me in my own life to try to build a less fragile life. And so I don't know, the idea of sharing your time and your insights, I think increasingly as we get older, we shift towards being responsible for others. And I don't know, there's this kind of getting phase of your career. Obviously we're all different, and in different professions and like, but there's a phase of your career where you're really hustling to get ahead, and you're hustling to succeed, and you're desperate to support your family. And for some of us this never ends, right? And so we are all different. But I think as you get older, you start to think, I was talking to Ray Dalio about this, like this idea that you reach a phase in your life where it becomes more important to make sure that the next generation is going to be okay without you. Mm-hmm. And so the idea of preparing your kids, the idea of writing books, doing podcasts, teaching, helping people who are younger, mentoring, becomes more and more important. But then at the same time, there's this torture that if you're not particularly organized and linear and systematic like me, it's very difficult to juggle all of those things. And so you always have this awareness that you're failing all sorts of people because they've written to you or they've asked you for help. Or so a high school kid from my daughter Madeline's class a few years ago when they were in high school has written to me a couple of times on LinkedIn, and I had written back to him a few weeks ago and said, I'm too busy at the moment, but write back to me, in March. And he's written back and he said, can we meet for coffee? And it's like, I want to meet with him, and I'm aware of the fact that I don't have time, and I'm aware of the fact that I'm in danger of forgetting, and I don't want to let him down. And so there's this constant pressure. It's not an easy thing to decide, but the underlying principle that you want to become more and more sharing and more giving is a really critical one.
Oh, mission critical. And, you even talked about that on a multitude of occasions as far as like valuing the truth, both within yourself and to others. And one of the most, we're getting a little vulnerable here, profound truth that you've admitted, and I believe it was to Stig when he was interviewing you, was the act of being kinder or more kind for the grammar Nazis out there. And so I know it sounds very elementary, but like, what have been some of the ways that you have worked on and successfully become kinder?
I've probably become a little bit better at not saying what's on my mind sometimes, and so I try pretty consciously. I'm pretty snarky and facetious, and I can always come up with a sarcastic comment that amuses me, but not necessarily anyone else. And I try to be a little more careful in what I say to my wife, in particular. And
that's very wise.
I give you an example. I mean, I've been married for 30 years, almost, and my wife Lauren is a very lovely and infinitely patient person. But I give you an example of something where I couldn't help myself. So many years ago, when I was a young writer, I do have a weakness, despite my saying that I don't care about my car and stuff like that. I have a weakness for expensive clothes that are very, not with labels and stuff, but like I'm wearing an incredibly soft cashmere sweater. Like it's a very luxurious cashmere sweater. And this just for kicking around in the house, right?
Yeah.
And so many years ago, when I was a young journalist, there was a sale and there was this exquisite cashmere jacket that I can't remember. I have a feeling it cost me like $1,500 or something like 30 years ago. And it was a crazy thing for a young journalist to buy. And my wife was so pissed, like so mad at me. And she said, "You think you're behaving like you're an investment banker and you're just a writer." And I, with a totally straight face, said to her, "But the person in the store said it was an investment."
Oh my God.
And she just went nuts. And it was, I typically have about one argument a year with my wife. But I think there were about 2 days where she didn't really want to talk to me after I said that.
Yeah.
And so that was something where I couldn't resist saying the thing that just was funny and slightly mean-spirited and provocative.
Oh, yeah.
And so I think one way that I've tried to become kinder is by holding my tongue at certain points rather than taking the cheap shot of saying something that's just on your mind in that instant or that's funny. But it's a struggle for me because I do really appreciate the wisecrack. And there was a moment where one of my kids said something like really insulting to me a couple of years ago that was so quick-witted and funny, and I just laughed. And I realized that in our family you got a lot of points for wit and speed of mind,
Mm-hmm.
and the rudeness didn't really matter. And then a year or so ago, I said something to my son Henry about. I was like, "So were we good parents? Do you think?" And he sort of looked at me and he said, "You did the best that you could with the tools that you had at the time." and it was like I looked at him like I thought maybe he was sort of joking, and I think I realized no, he's sort of telling the truth.
Uh-huh.
And it was brutal and funny and a little bit mean,
Sure.
and really truthful. And I just thought that's pretty cool.
Well,
and I was at a dinner with George Soros's son, and I quoted that to him, and he laughed uproariously. Like, I mean, it's sort of it's brilliant and so so brutal. So I think controlling what you say is a really tough one because you want to be truthful, but you don't want to be cruel.
Yes.
And that's difficult. That's been hard for me. Another thing, I think increasingly, I think you want to try to show up for people, for your friends and stuff. And I realized that I've not been very good at that over the years because I was so busy working and I'm sort of distracted, and so it's hard for me to be productive. And so I end up working a lot on Sundays and at night and stuff like that. And so it's hard for me often to show up for people. And I think increasingly I realize just how important it is to try to show up for your friends and for your family. But I'm constantly failing at this stuff.
Right.
So I have a pretty well developed sense of guilt of all of the ways in which I'm not living up to the things I believe in. But I mean, I randomly opened this book by Elimelech of Lezhensk, as I mentioned before, whose death anniversary it was. And so I did this literally like 2 minutes before our conversation. And the page that I randomly opened up is about this great teaching that the world is built on mercy. And it's this teaching that, originally it says that the creator, could have built the world based on judgment, where like if we screw up, we get kind of zapped immediately. Like if like it would be like putting your tongue in the electric socket and you'd immediately get zapped for your stupidity. But because we're so flawed, there's a very small, tiny minority of people who actually behave in a sort of deeply ethical, truthful, decent, sin-free kind of way. And for most of us, we're all sort of so deeply flawed that we screw up the whole time. And so one of the great teachings is that the world was built on mercy. And so that's a really powerful... So time in itself delays judgment, right? So you do something and the passage of time gives you a chance to see what you got wrong, to learn from your mistake, and to build in a little mercy to change your ways. And likewise, because the whole world is built on mercy, you increasingly want to be extending mercy to other people. So there are different terms for mercy, right? So mercy, compassion, kindness, and I think it's all translations of the same word in Hebrew, chesed, which means mercy or compassion or kindness. And so, so I start to think, well, so I need to be more kind and compassionate to myself, but I also need to be more kind and compassionate to other people. And if I want to be treated with kindness and compassion and mercy, then I have to extend it to other people. And so when you see somebody's flaw or they're failing, or you see them screw up in some terrible way, I try to sort of remind myself, well, if I were in that position, I was really stressed and I had the upbringing they had and I had the pressure they had, I would behave that way too. And so just as I need people to extend compassion to me, let me extend it to them. So I think some of it, so even something like that little teaching that I opened randomly from Elimelech of Lezhensk, it opens up this whole kind of rabbit hole. So 1 minute before our interview, 2 minutes before our interview, I'm reading this book by this guy, and I have this sense that I'm being guided because it's his death anniversary, and on someone's death anniversary, the Kabbalists will say that all of their energy is basically revealed and accessible. And so it's like, at that moment, Elimelech of Lezhensk is here and teaching me this truth about mercy and kindness and compassion. And then you ask me about kindness.
Yes.
And so that's kind of beautiful to me. And so in a way, this is what makes life kind of complicated for me, because I have this infinite capacity to fall down rabbit holes. Mm-hmm. But also for me, that's sort of where the beauty lies. Yes. Falling down these rabbit holes.
Well, and I got to tell you, William, if you need to vent and get out the snarkiness or assholic comments, you are always welcome to text me or call me. And then if I come out to New York, or eventually when I come out to New York, you can just get it all out. And then your wife's going to go, man, you are like unorthodoxly kind. Like, what happened? And then she'll go, oh, you must have just gotten it all out on Chris. And then it'll be phenomenal.
I do have I have lots of Post-its. My walls just got repainted, so all of the Post-its are down, except there's a filing cabinet here that has a whole bunch of Post-its. And one of my favorite Post-its is actually a message that my wife wrote to me many years ago that says something like, I'm so glad I married a kind man, or something like that. And that's high praise.
Yes.
Because she's certainly seen me behave very poorly and be rude. I haven't made her cry in 48 hours. Not since.
That's good. Since the week. We're gonna keep the good times rolling. Well, and you mentioned the stressful aspect of things, and one of the quotes that hit me actually the deepest was both in markets and in life, the goal isn't to embrace risk or eschew it, but to bear it intelligently while never forgetting the possibility of an unpleasant outcome. And your career has been anything but easy. And I think everyone's is to an extent that way. But as you become more in the public eye, even if you don't try to, when you write a book, and yours is a great book, but even if you wrote a book and it sucks, like an author, you suddenly have more clout and you're more vulnerable with that. And, going off of that quote, were there any moments that in your career where you thought that unpleasant outcome was going to occur? And more importantly, like you said, you may not feel like you could just hang it up like Bill Miller, but make no mistake about it, I don't think you'd be able to afford the time like you've given graciously today if you were just completely financially destitute. And so what was it like when you turned that corner financially, and what did you do to make sure that you didn't go backwards and you truly capitalized on your finances?
I mean, to some extent, I still have this deep-seated fear of not being okay. And so I'm trying to guard against disaster, because I mean, it may be partly coming from a Jewish background where our ancestors had to flee from Russia and Poland and Ukraine, and we're reminded again, Elimelech of Lizhensk was from, that kind of Poland, Ukraine area. And I visited his grave there. And, in the middle of winter where it's all sort of snowy and bleak. So I know where my family fled from because of pogroms and persecution. And so, I know that things can turn really bad. So this whole idea of the margin of safety that comes from Ben Graham, it's not coincidental that it comes from Ben Graham, who was Buffett's teacher and whose real name was Benjamin Grossbaum, and whose grandfather, I think, was the chief rabbi in Warsaw. So he came from a background of Jews who fled from pogroms and chaos in Eastern Europe that we're seeing again in Ukraine now with war and chaos in Eastern Europe. So the idea of the margin of safety, both in investing and life, is to say life is uncertain, things can go wrong, I can make mistakes, I'm flawed, I'm vulnerable. Let me build in a margin of safety by, for example, buying things for less than their worth and diversifying so that I'm not pushing the envelope in a dangerous way. And so even now when, my situation, thank God, is a good one.
Yes. I
don't have a huge amount of debt on my home, and I remortgaged during the period where interest rates were low, so I locked in a 30-year mortgage at whatever it was, 3 and a bit %. And I haven't got a fancy new car, and, I paid for my kids' college education without any debt. I didn't saddle them with any debt, so I'm very wary of debt even now. Have plenty of cash sitting in my bank accounts because I don't want to take undue risk, and I try to take advantage of, my 401k plans and my IRAs and my 529 plans, and we max out on all of those things. And I'm very careful about expenses in the investments that I have. So I make sure that I'm investing in vehicles that have very low expenses and fees, because I know that compounds against me. So again, there are a lot of ways in which you can protect yourself from uncertainty by doing sensible things that stack the odds in your favor. I try, I own 3 individual stocks, one of which I've owned for years, which is just Berkshire Hathaway, which I just own because it's very diversified and it's,
sure.
I'm not saying this is a recommendation. It's just like, it's relatively conservative, and he has lots of cash that he's sitting on.
He does.
In case of disaster. And so again, it's like, it's investing with people who are conservative. And the other 2 stocks I bought have kind of been duds. but the fact that they've been duds doesn't really matter because I didn't put too much in them.
Right.
And so again, you're defending against your own stupidity, overconfidence, emotional vulnerability. You don't want to put too much in one or two things in case you're wrong, because you don't want to be in a position where you're the person who looks at your portfolio and is like, oh my God, I can't believe I did that. And so building a sort of somewhat anti-fragile portfolio and a somewhat anti-fragile life really increases the odds that you're not going to slip back into chaos, God forbid. And that comes in every area of your life. So if I drive safely, or I drive a car that has good safety features, I'm stacking the odds in my favor that things will be okay. I still don't have control over other people's driving, but if I text while I'm driving, I'm stacking the odds in my favor of having a terrible outcome. If I drink and drive, likewise, I'm tilting the odds of disaster against myself in a dangerous way. So likewise, if you go out to a bar, I mean, this is something Tom Gaynor talked about in my book. If you go to a bar and you have too many drinks and you're not with your wife or your husband or your significant other, you increase the odds that you're going to do something stupid that you live to regret. And so there are all of these ways in which you can stack the odds so that your marriage is more likely to survive, so that your kids are more likely to be decent and kind and loving humans, so that your finances are more likely to work out okay. So I've talked a lot to Guy Spear about this, and one of the things that Guy has said to me is he's trying to create a portfolio that's sort of like a resilient garden in a way. So it needs to be diverse enough so that it can survive his own flaws and emotional vulnerability and distractibility. I think that's really important. You want to look at your own frailty and your own vulnerability, your psychological vulnerability, and structure your life and your portfolio so that you're likely to be able to exercise good judgment, that you won't panic at the worst time. So if I had put an enormous amount of my assets in Alibaba, the fact that it's down 57% since I bought it would be really upsetting. The fact that I didn't put that much means I don't really care. I'm kind of amused by it.
Right.
And, I'm not pleased, but I'm kind of amused, and I tell the story because it's a way of reminding people not to get too overconfident.
Right.
And it's a way of rubbing my nose in my own mistakes so that I don't hopefully repeat it. And so you're trying to create an environment for yourself that in a way is error resistant. You're recognizing your own stupidity, your own hubris, your own capacity for chasing after fads or buying things because somebody you admire says you should buy it. And one of my investments I made because Monish bought it, and it's done terribly.
Yeah.
And Monish sold it.
Yeah.
But I'm still in it.
Yes.
And I just shouldn't. I don't know. It was a perfectly sensible thing to do. Mm-hmm. But probably for my own peace of mind, it would be better for me not to own any individual stocks other than Berkshire.
Yeah.
And to have that as a sort of permanent investment. So just I think your listeners should just be thinking about how to structure their portfolio and their lives in a way that enable them to think calmly, to survive disaster, to survive setbacks, so that you live to fight another day. And it's the same with things like exercise, right? I really don't like exercise very much. But I'm aware that I have to exercise. I'm aware that I have to try to control my diet, and it's not easy. But I'm vegetarian. It's 12:50 in the afternoon. I haven't had breakfast yet, and I've only had black coffee. And it's like I'm sort of tilting the odds in my favor by trying, despite all my flaws and all my greed in wanting to eat more and more bread, I'm trying at least to tilt the odds in my favor so that I won't get too out of control.
Absolutely. Well, and I won't take too much of your time, but I do have just one or two more questions, and then at that point, it's up to you to decide to either go gluten or to continue to restrain.
Yeah, I'm going to have to go soon because I'm also on a deadline. So
Absolutely.
Pick your favorite of those two questions.
Yes, favorite of the two. So what are the things that you are working on right now that is getting you excited to wake up every day and just spread to the world?
The stuff that I've been studying in Tibetan Buddhism is very beautiful and very profound. And so I had on my podcast, the Richer, Wiser, Happier podcast, an episode where I interviewed Daniel Goleman, who wrote the book on emotional intelligence, and a guy called Tsoknyi Rinpoche, which is spelled Tsoknyi Rinpoche, and Rinpoche means precious one. And he's an extraordinary Tibetan Buddhist meditation master who's from a great lineage of meditation masters. And I've been studying his stuff, his teachings very seriously. And we talk about it quite a bit in that episode. And there are some very profound teachings there that are beneficial in every area of life, including investing. And I mean, one of the most fundamental is that he uses this practice called handshake practice that we talk about in that episode, where when you see your emotions arising in some way that's really uncomfortable, whether it's anxiety or fear or jealousy or anger or rage or whatever it might be, a sense of your own lack or worry about the future, or we all have these things that come out at certain points, particularly under stress, I think. Tsoknyi Rinpoche has this practice where he kind of looks at the emotion that's arising, and he essentially handshakes it. He says, "Oh, hi, there you are. Okay, there's jealousy, there's resentment. Okay, there's anxiety." Like I saw this morning, my eye suddenly started twitching at certain points when I thought about certain things that I had to do today, and anxiety. Okay, oh, that's interesting. That's bringing up that emotion, and one of the things that's very beautiful about what Tsoknyi Rinpoche is doing is he doesn't judge the emotion that's coming up, and he doesn't suppress it, and he's not even trying to change it. All he's doing is abiding with it with this kind of gentle, kind awareness. And so you're just saying, okay, hi. And he calls these emotions or these difficult patterns or these schema that repeat from our childhood and keep coming back. Like it might be your sense of nobody ever really thinks I'm good enough. How come nobody believes in me? How come my mom loves him more than me? How come my bosses never appreciate me? Whatever it is, or fear that you'll never have enough, or you'll never be successful, or so we have these schemas, these patterns that repeat, that maybe come from childhood, maybe just part of our wiring. Who knows? I'm no psychologist, as you can tell, but Tsoknyi Rinpoche calls these things our beautiful monsters, and so he says, one day we will be friends with all of our beautiful monsters. And he says that when you handshake your beautiful monsters, when this stuff arises, and you're gentle and you're kind and you're compassionate to them, really just by being present with them. It's not like, oh, I'm applying kindness now. I'm gonna resolve this by being so kind to my fear of failure or my sense that I'm not good enough or whatever it might be. It's not that. He says that the non-judging is kindness. The awareness is kindness. Just being with them is kindness. And as you become aware of them, for some reason, these difficult emotions kind of open up, and And this is something that I've also learned from David Hawkins from a book of his called Letting Go. I would really encourage people to read Letting Go, and particularly chapter 2 is kind of extraordinary, where he discusses the letting go mechanism. And what Hawkins said is that when you resist these difficult emotions, the resistance gives them energy and sustains them. And so there's something about this path of radical non-resistance that allows these difficult emotions or patterns in our thinking to open up and soften. And because everything changes, as we know from Buddhism, it's going to change anyway. So maybe there's a moment where you feel flooded and upset about something, but it's going to change. It's going to move on. And so the ability to abide softly and gently and kindly and non-judgmentally with whatever arises in this open space of our mind and our body, and to look at it and be like, oh, okay, so a little bit of tension here in my back of my neck, or in the back of my head, or here in the front of my forehead, or a little bit of tightness here in my chest, and to be like, oh, okay, oh, that's how I'm feeling. Okay, hi.
Yeah.
That's a very powerful and practical and beautiful teaching, because when we were growing up, nobody really taught us how to deal with our difficult emotions and these difficult views of ourselves, or these inherited patterns, and you know, or learned patterns from childhood, or say, you know, let's say, you know, you went through a tumultuous period where, you know, you got sick, or you lost a job, or you lost lots of money, or you got cheated, or somebody did something really cruel to you, or they left you, or, you know, you were, you know, so there's some kind of trauma that gave you a particular kind of belief system or fear of being abandoned, or whatever it might be. I think it's very helpful to look at those things instead of repressing them because they're too painful, or repressing them and then judging somebody else because that's easier. So you project onto someone else, and you're like, I hate this guy because look, look how he's behaving. And then you're like, why is it that I hate that guy? Oh, because he makes me feel small, because I don't have respect for myself, because I feel small, because I feel inadequate. And you don't really even need to go through all of that analysis necessarily, although obviously it's very helpful for many people. But some of it is just looking at the emotion and being like, and looking at how it shows up in your body, and being like, oh, okay, there it is. Hi.
Yeah.
And then it softens. And so that I'm very excited about, because that gives me a way of dealing with you know, lingering aspects of my own personality or wiring that I don't think have helped me, and kind of liberating them in some way, or being just coexisting with them in a gentle, loving way, rather than being like, I can't believe I'm still that way, what a schmuck, I hate myself, you know. And so then I can see, for example, if I turn against myself, if I start to beat myself up, I can watch that and be like, oh, okay, that's what's happening. That's the pattern. Or if I start to get overwhelmed by the complexity of all the things coming at me, and I start to resent people because they keep coming to me to ask me to do stuff, and I'm like, oh yeah, I'm overwhelmed. Okay, yeah, there's that sense of being overwhelmed again. And so it's sort of a lesson in being present gently and kindly with whatever arises. And this is a powerful and deep teaching that I think runs through many different spiritual paths. But I think that Tibetan Buddhists like Tsoknyi Rinpoche were particularly skilled at seeing this stuff and articulating it. And so I would say, if people want to learn more about it, look at that episode of the Richer, Wiser, Happier podcast where I interviewed Tsoknyi Rinpoche and Dan Goleman. And then there's also a book that they just wrote together called Why We Meditate. And Tsoknyi also has this website, Fully Being, that I found very helpful. And I think he's a very beautiful teacher. I think he's got deep wisdom. And you look at him and you're like, this guy's kind of free in certain ways. And so he's managed to deal with his own beautiful monsters in a remarkable way. And so when you find someone who's further along the path than you are in any area, whether it's investing, writing, or spiritually, or as a meditator, or as a chef, or whatever it is, in nutrition, in exercise, to look at them and be like, okay, what can I learn from this person? And then how can I apply it to my own situation? Because he's from a lineage of 1,000 years of Tibetan Buddhist masters, so he grew up with one of the great sages in Tibetan Buddhism, and he had another teacher who was the same teacher that the Dalai Lama had. He has certain advantages that I didn't have in those areas, but I have other advantages in different areas. So I can learn some of this stuff from him because he's a master of the mind. He's sat with his mind for years.
Yes. Without
doing anything, just focusing on what was going on in his mind and getting clarity about the nature of the mind. And so I want to learn from that.
Well,
and share it, hopefully.
Yeah, and to conclude this incredible episode, I know we've gone way over. I wanted to, on behalf of everything you just said, thank you for being an incredible podcast host and author that I look up to tremendously. And when you come out with your next book, you're going to have to hit me up because we're going to have you back on the show. But I just wanted to say it's been a pleasure having you on, and I look forward to many, many, many capitalized outings in the future.
Thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure chatting with you, and I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of these ideas, albeit in a very long-winded and verbose way, because I always talk too much. So if anyone's managed to make it to this point, I congratulate them on their persistence.
That is A-okay. And for capitalizers listening in, as always, thank you for tuning in to this lovely episode of Capitalize Your Finances. If you have any questions about today's episode, you know the drill by now. Either shoot me an email, chris@capitalizeyourfinances.com, or you can give me a call at 253-214-3050, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that come into your pea-sized brain, as William mentioned earlier. If you have any questions or any people of clout that you think, hey, they need to hop on Capitalize Your Finances, head on over to capitalizepodcast.com. Shoot me an email. We look at it every single day, and I'd be more than happy to scan, screen, and maybe get them on the show. As always, I'm your host, Christopher Paniotti, the Cap and Capitalize. And until next time, keep capitalizing.
You should always seek counsel of the appropriate advisor prior to making any investment decision. All investments are subject to risk, including the loss of principal. This material was gathered from sources believed to be reliable. However, its accuracy cannot be guaranteed. The information contained herein does not constitute an offer to sell or a solicitation of an offer to buy securities. Investment products described herein may not be offered for sale in any state or jurisdiction in which such an offer, solicitation, or sale would be unlawful or prohibited by the specific offering documentation. No client or prospective client should assume that the information presented serves as the receipt of or a substitute for personalized advice from Capitalize Your Finances or from any other investment professional. Diversification strategies do not ensure a profit and cannot protect against losses in a declining market. IRA withdrawals will be taxed at ordinary income rates. Withdrawals prior to age 59.5 may also be subject to a 10% penalty tax. Earnings from a 529 college savings plan can grow tax deferred and may be withdrawn free of federal taxes when used for qualified education expenses. Non-qualified withdrawals are subject to a 10% penalty tax. Christopher Paniotti is a registered representative with and securities and advisory services offered through LPL Financial, a registered investment advisor and member FINRA SIPC. The investment professionals are affiliated with LPL Financial and are conducting business using the name Capitalize Your Finances, a separate entity from LPL Financial. William Green and any other individual or company mentioned in this podcast are not affiliated with Capitalize Your Finances or LPL Financial.